This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 3. A Progress. I have a great deal of difficulty in beginning to write my portion of these pages, for I know I am not clever. I always knew that. I can remember, when I was a very little girl indeed, I used to say to my doll, when we were alone together, "Now, Dolly, I am not clever. You know very well, and you must be patient with me, like a dear." And so she used to sit propped up in a great armchair, with her beautiful complexion and rosy lips, staring at me, or not so much at me, I think, as at nothing, while I busily stitched away and told her every one of my secrets. My dear old doll! I was such a shy little thing that I seldom dared to open my lips, and never dared to open my heart to anybody else. It almost makes me cry to think what a relief it used to be to me, when I came home from school of a day, to run upstairs to my room and say, "Oh, you dear faithful Dolly, I knew you would be expecting me," and then to sit down on the floor, leaning on the elbow of her great chair, and tell her all I had noticed since we parted. I had always rather a noticing way, not a quick way. Oh no, a silent way of noticing what passed before me, and thinking I should like to understand it better. I have not by any means a quick understanding. When I love a person very tenderly indeed, it seems to brighten, but even that may be my vanity. I was brought up, from my earliest remembrance, like some of the princesses in the fairy stories, only I was not charming, by my godmother. At least, I only knew her as such. She was a good, good woman. She went to church 3 times every Sunday, and to morning prayers on Wednesdays and Fridays, and to lectures whenever there were lectures, and never missed. She was handsome, and if she had ever smiled, would have been, I used to think, like an angel. But she never smiled. She was always grave and strict. She was so very good herself, I thought, that the badness of other people made her frown all her life. I felt so different from her, even making every allowance for the differences between a child and a woman. I felt so poor, so trifling, and so far off that I could never be unrestrained with her. No, could never even love her as I wished. It made me very sorry to consider how good she was, and how unworthy of her I was, and I used ardently to hope that I might have a better heart, and I talked it over very often with the dear old doll, but I never loved my godmother as I ought to have loved her, and as I felt I must have loved her had I been a better girl. This made me, I dare say, more timid and retiring than I naturally was, and cast me upon Dolly as the only friend with whom I felt at ease. But something happened when I was still quite a little thing, that helped it very much. I had never heard my mamma spoken of. I had never heard of my papa either, but I felt more interested about my mamma. I had never worn a black frock that I could recollect. I had never been shown my mamma's grave. I had never been told where it was. Yet I had never been taught to pray for any relation but my godmother. I had more than once approached this subject of my thoughts with Mrs. Rachel, our only servant, who took my light away when I was in bed, another very good woman, but austere to me, and she had only said, "Esther, good night," and gone away and left me. Although there were 7 girls at the neighbouring school where I was a day boarder, and although they called me little Esther Summerson, I knew none of them at home. All of them were older than I, to be sure. I was the youngest there by a good deal. But there seemed to be some other separation between us besides that, and besides their being far more clever than I was, and knowing much more than I did. One of them, in the first week of my going to the school, I remember it very well, invited me home to a little party, to my great joy. But my godmother wrote a stiff letter declining for me, and I never went. I never went out at all. It was my birthday. There were holidays at school on other birthdays, none on mine. There were rejoicings at home on other birthdays, as I knew from what I had heard the girls relate to one another. There were none on mine. My birthday was the most melancholy day at home in the whole year. I have mentioned that, unless my vanity should deceive me, as I know it may, for I may be very vain without suspecting it, though indeed I don't. My comprehension is quickened when my affection is. My disposition is very affectionate, and perhaps I might still feel such a wound, if such a wound could be received more than once, with the quickness of that birthday. Dinner was over, and my godmother and I were sitting at the table before the fire. The clock ticked, the fire clicked. Not another sound had been heard in the room or in the house, for I don't know how long. I happened to look timidly up from my stitching across the table, at my godmother, and I saw in her face, looking gloomily at me, "It would have been far better, little Esther, that you had had no birthday, that you had never been born." I broke out crying and sobbing, and I said, "Oh, dear godmother, tell me, pray do tell me, did mamma die on my birthday?" "No," she returned, "ask me no more, child." "Oh, pray do tell me something of her. Do now, at last, dear godmother, if you please. What did I do to her? How did I lose her? Why am I so different from other children? And why is it my fault, dear godmother? No, 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 don't go away. Oh, speak to me." I was in a kind of fright beyond my grief, and I caught hold of her dress and was kneeling to her. But she had been saying all the while, "Let me go." But now she stood still. Her darkened face had such power over me that it stopped me in the midst of my vehemence. I put up my trembling little hand to clasp hers, or to beg her pardon with what earnestness I might, but withdrew it as she looked at me, and laid it on my fluttering heart. She raised me, sat in her chair, and standing me before her, said slowly, in a cold, low voice, I see her knitted brow and pointed finger, "Your mother, Esther, is your disgrace, and you were hers. The time will come, and soon enough, when you will understand this better, and will feel it too, as no one save a woman can. I have forgiven her." But her face did not relent. "The wrong she did to me, and I say no more of it, though it was greater than you will ever know, than anyone will ever know, but I, the sufferer. For yourself, unfortunate girl, orphaned and degraded from the first of these evil anniversaries, pray daily that the sins of others be not visited upon your head, according to what is written. Forget your mother and leave all other people to forget her, who will do her unhappy child that greatest kindness. Now go." She checked me, however, as I was about to depart from her, so frozen as I was, and added this: "Submission, self-denial, diligent work are the preparations for a life begun with such a shadow on it. You are different from other children, Esther, because you were not born, like them, in common sinfulness and wrath. You are set apart." I went up to my room and crept to bed and laid my doll's cheek against mine wet with tears, and holding that solitary friend upon my bosom, cried myself to sleep. Imperfect as my understanding of my sorrow was, I knew that I had brought no joy at any time to anybody's heart, and that I was no one upon earth what Dolly was to me. Dear, dear, to think how much time we passed alone together afterwards, and how often I repeated to the doll the story of my birthday, and confided to her that I would try, as hard as ever I could, to repair the fault I had been born with, of which I confessedly felt guilty and yet innocent, and would strive as I grew up to be industrious, contented, and kind-hearted, and to do some good to someone, and win some love to myself if I could. I hope it is not self-indulgent to shed these tears as I think of it. I am very thankful, I am very cheerful, but I cannot quite help their coming to my eyes. There, I have wiped them away now, and can go on again properly. I felt the distance between my godmother and myself so much more after the birthday, and felt so sensible of filling a place in her house which ought to have been empty, that I found her more difficult of approach, though I was fervently grateful to her in my heart, than ever. I felt in the same way toward my school companions. I felt in the same way towards Mrs. Rachel, who was a widow, and towards her daughter, of whom she was proud, who came to see her once a fortnight. I was very retired and quiet, and tried to be very diligent. One Sunday afternoon, when I came home from school with my books and portfolio, watching my long shadow at my side, and as I was gliding upstairs to my room as usual, my godmother looked out of the parlour door and called me back. Sitting with her, I found, which was very unusual indeed, a stranger. A portly, important-looking gentleman, dressed all in black, with a white cravat, large gold watch seals, a pair of gold eyeglasses, and a large seal ring upon his little finger. "This," said my godmother in an undertone, "is the child." Then she said, in her naturally stern way of speaking, "This is Esther, sir." The gentleman put his eyeglasses to look at me, and said, "Come here, my dear." He shook hands with me, and asked me to take off my bonnet, looking at me all the while. When I had complied, he said, "Ah," and afterwards, "Yes," and then taking off his eyeglasses, and folding them in a red case, and leaning back in his armchair, turned the case about in his two hands. He gave my godmother a nod. Upon that my godmother said, "You may go upstairs, Esther," and I made him my curtsy and left him. It must have been 2 years afterward, and I was almost 14, when one dreadful night my godmother and I sat at the fireside. I was reading aloud, and she was listening. I had come down at 9 o'clock, as I always did, to read the Bible to her, and was reading from St. John, how our Saviour stooped down, writing with his finger in the dust, when they brought the sinful woman to him. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. I was stopped by my godmother's rising, putting her hand to her head, and crying out in an awful voice from quite another part of the book. Watch ye therefore, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch. In an instant, while she stood before me repeating these words, she fell down on the floor. I had no need to cry out. Her voice had sounded through the house, and been heard in the street. She was laid upon her bed. For more than a week she lay there, little altered outwardly, with her old handsome resolute frown that I knew so well carved upon her face. Many and many a time, in the day and in the night, with my head upon the pillow by her, that my whispers might be plainer to her, I kissed her, thanked her, prayed for her, asked her for her blessing and forgiveness, entreated her to give me the least sign that she knew or heard me. No, no, her face was immovable to the very last, and even afterwards her frown remained unsoftened. On the day after my poor good godmother was buried, the gentleman in black with the white neckcloth reappeared. I was sent for by Mrs. Rachel, and found him in the same place as if he had never gone away. "My name is Kenji," he said. "You may remember it, my child. Kenji and Cowboy, Lincoln's Inn." I replied that I remembered to have seen him once before. "Pray be seated, here near me. Don't distress yourself. It's of no use, Mrs. Rachel. I needn't inform you, who were acquainted with the late Miss Barbary's affairs, that her means die with her, and that this young lady, now her aunt is dead." "My aunt, sir?" "It is really of no use carrying on a deception when no object is to be gained by it," said Mr. Kenji smoothly. "Aunt in fact, though not in law. Don't distress yourself. Don't weep. Don't tremble, Mrs. Rachel. Our young friend has no doubt heard of the jaundice and jaundice." "Never," said Mrs. Rachel. "Is it possible," pursued Mr. Kenji, putting up his eyeglasses, "that our young friend, I beg you won't distress yourself, never heard of jaundice and jaundice?" I shook my head, wondering even what it was. "Not of jaundice and jaundice?" said Mr. Kenji, looking over his glasses at me, and softly turning the case about and about, as if he were petting something. "Not of one of the greatest chancery suits known? Not of jaundice and jaundice, in itself a monument of chancery practice, in which, I would say, every difficulty, every contingency, every masterly fiction, every form of procedure known in that court is represented over and over again? It is a cause that could not exist out of this free and great country. I should say that the aggregate of costs in jaundice and jaundice, Mrs. Rachel," I was afraid he addressed himself to her, because I appeared inattentive, "amounts, at the present hour, to from 60 to 70,000 pounds," said Mr. Kenji, leaning back in his chair. I felt very ignorant, but what could I do? I was so entirely unacquainted with the subject that I understood nothing about it even then. "And she really never heard of the cause?" said Mr. Kenji. "Surprising." "Miss Barbary, sir. returned Mrs. Rachel, who is now among the seraphim. I hope so, I am sure, said Mr. Kenji politely. Wished Esther only to know what would be serviceable to her, and she knows, from any teaching she has had here, nothing more. Well, said Mr. Kenji, upon the whole very proper. Now to the point, addressing me. Miss Barbary, your sole relation. In fact, that is, for I am bound to observe that in law you had none. Being deceased, and it is naturally not being to be expected that Mrs. Rachel— Oh dear no, said Mrs. Rachel quickly. Quite so, assented Mr. Kenji. That Mrs. Rachel should charge herself with your maintenance and support. I beg you won't distress yourself. You are in a position to receive the renewal of an offer which I was instructed to make to Miss Barbary some 2 years ago, and which, though rejected then, was understood to be renewable under the lamentable circumstances that have since occurred. Now, if I avow that I represent, in jaundice and otherwise, a highly humane, but at the same time singular man, shall I compromise myself by any stretch of my professional caution? Said Mr. Kenji, leaning back in his chair again, and looking calmly at us both. He appeared to enjoy beyond everything the sound of his own voice. I couldn't wonder at that, for it was mellow and full, and gave great importance to every word he uttered. He listened to himself with obvious satisfaction, and sometimes gently beat time to his own music with his head, or rounded a sentence with his hand. I was very much impressed by him, even then, before I knew that he formed himself on the model of a great lord, who was his client, and that he was generally called Conversation Kenji. Mr. Jarndyce, he pursued, being aware of the, I would say, desolate position of our young friend, offers to place her at a first-rate establishment, where her education shall be completed, where her comfort shall be secured, and where her reasonable wants shall be anticipated, where she shall be eminently qualified to discharge her duty in that station of life unto which it has pleased, shall I say Providence, to call her. My heart was filled so full, both by what he said and by his affecting manner of saying it, that I was not able to speak, though I tried. Mr. Jarndyce, he went on, makes no condition beyond expressing his expectation that our young friend will not at any time remove herself from the establishment in question without his knowledge and concurrence, that she will faithfully apply herself to the acquisition of those accomplishments, upon the exercise of which she will be ultimately dependent, that she will tread in the paths of virtue and honour, and so forth. I was still less able to speak than before. Now, what does our young friend say? Proceeded Mr. Kenji. Take time, take time. I pause for her reply, but take time. What the destitute subject of such an offer tried to say, I need not repeat. What she did say, I could more easily tell, if it were worth the telling. What she felt, and will feel to her dying hour, I could never relate. This interview took place at Windsor, where I had passed, as far as I knew, my whole life. On that day week, amply provided with all necessaries, I left it, inside the stage-coach, for Reading. Mrs. Rachel was too good to feel any emotion at parting, but I was not so good, and wept bitterly. I thought that I ought to have known her better after so many years, and ought to have made myself enough of a favourite with her to make her sorry then. When she gave me one cold parting kiss upon my forehead, like a thaw drop from the stone porch, it was a very frosty day. I felt so miserable and self-reproachful that I clung to her and told her it was my fault, I knew, that she could say good-bye so easily. "No, Esther," she returned, "it is your misfortune." The coach was at the little lawn gate. We had not come out until we heard the wheels, and thus I left her, with a sorrowful heart. She went in before my boxes were lifted to the coach roof, and shut the door. As long as I could see the house, I looked back at it from the window, through my tears. My godmother had left Mrs. Rachel all the little property she possessed, and there was to be a sale, and an old hearth rug with roses on it, which always seemed to me the first thing in the world I had ever seen, was hanging outside in the frost and snow. A day or two before, I had wrapped the dear old doll in her own shawl, and quietly laid her, I am half ashamed to tell it, in the garden earth, under the tree that shaded my old window. I had no companion left but my bird, and him I carried with me in his cage. When the house was out of sight, I sat, with my bird cage in the straw at my feet, forward on the low seat, to look out of the high window, watching the frosty trees that were like beautiful pieces of spar, and the fields all smooth and white with last night's snow, and the sun so red but yielding so little heat, and the ice dark like metal where the skaters and sliders had brushed the snow away. There was a gentleman in the coach who sat on the opposite seat and looked very large in a quantity of wrappings, but he sat gazing out of the other window and took no notice of me. I thought of my dead godmother, of the night when I read to her, of her frowning so fixedly and sternly in her bed, of the strange place I was going to, of the people I should find there, and what they would be like, and what they would say to me, when a voice in the coach gave me a terrible start. It said, "What the devil are you crying for?" I was so frightened that I lost my voice, and could only answer in a whisper, "Me, sir?" For of course I knew it must have been the gentleman in the quantity of wrappings, though he was still looking out of his window. "Yes, you," he said, turning round. "I didn't know I was crying, sir," I faltered. "But you are," said the gentleman. "Look here." He came quite opposite to me from the other corner of the coach, brushed one of his large furry cuffs across my eyes, but without hurting me, and showed me that it was wet. "There, now you know you are," he said, "don't you?" "Yes, sir," I said. "And what are you crying for?" said the gentleman. "Don't you want to go there?" "Where, sir?" "Where? Why, wherever you are going," said the gentleman. "I am very glad to go there," I answered. "Well, then, look glad," said the gentleman. I thought he was very strange, or at least that what I could see of him was very strange, for he was wrapped up to the chin, and his face was almost hidden in a fur cap, with broad fur straps at the side of his head, fastened under his chin. But I was composed again, and not afraid of him. So I told him that I thought I must have been crying, because of my godmother's death, and because of Mrs. Rachel's not being sorry to part with me. "Confound Mrs. Rachel," said the gentleman. "Let her fly away in a high wind on a broomstick." I began to be really afraid of him now, and looked at him with the greatest astonishment. But I thought that he had pleasant eyes, although he kept on muttering to himself in an angry manner, and calling Mrs. Rachel names. After a little while he opened his outer wrapper, which appeared to me large enough to wrap up the whole coach, and put his arm down in a deep pocket in the side. "Now look here," he said. "In this paper," which was nicely folded, "is a piece of the best plum cake that can be got for money, sugar on the outside an inch thick, like fat on mutton chops. Here's a little pie. A gem this is, both for size and quality, made in France. And what do you suppose it's made of? Livers of fat geese. There's a pie. Now let's see you eat 'em." "Thank you, sir," I replied. "Thank you very much indeed, but I hope you won't be offended. They are too rich for me." "Floored again," said the gentleman, which I didn't at all understand, and threw them both out of window. He did not speak to me any more until he got out of the coach a little way short of Reading, when he advised me to be a good girl and to be studious, and shook hands with me. I must say I was relieved by his departure. We left him at a milestone. I often walked past it afterwards, and never for a long time, without thinking of him, and half expecting to meet him. But I never did, and so, as time went on, he passed out of my mind. When the coach stopped, a very neat lady looked up at the window and said, "Miss Donny?" "No, ma'am, Esther Summerson." "That is quite right," said the lady. "Miss Donny." I now understood that she introduced herself by that name, and begged Miss Donny's pardon for my mistake, and pointed out my boxes at her request. Under the direction of a very neat maid, they were put outside a very small green carriage, and then Miss Donny, the maid, and I got inside and were driven away. "Everything is ready for you, Esther," said Miss Donny, "and the scheme of your pursuits has been arranged in exact accordance with the wishes of your guardian, Mr. Jarndyce." Did you say, ma'am? "Of your guardian, Mr. Jarndyce," said Miss Donny. I was so bewildered that Miss Donny thought the cold had been too severe for me, and lent me her smelling bottle. "Do you know my guardian, Mr. Jarndyce, ma'am?" I asked, after a good deal of hesitation. "Not personally, Esther," said Miss Donny, "merely through his solicitors, Messrs. Kenge and Carboy, of London. A very superior gentleman, Mr. Kenge. Truly eloquent indeed. Some of his periods quite majestic." I felt this to be very true, but was too confused to attend to it. Our speedy arrival at our destination, before I had time to recover myself, increased my confusion, and I never shall forget the uncertain and the unreal air of everything at Greenleaf, Miss Donny's house, that afternoon. But I soon became used to it. I was so adapted to the routine of Greenleaf before long, that I seemed to have been there a great while, and almost to have dreamed, rather than really lived, my old life at my godmother's. Nothing could be more precise, exact, and orderly than Greenleaf. There was a time for everything all round the dial of the clock, and everything was done at its appointed moment. We were 12 boarders. There were 2 Miss Donnys, twins. It was understood that I would have to depend by and by on my qualifications as a governess, and I was not only instructed in everything that was taught at Greenleaf, but was very soon engaged in helping to instruct others. Although I was treated in every other respect like the rest of the school, this single difference was made in my case from the first. As I began to know more, I taught more, and so in course of time I had plenty to do, which I was very fond of doing, because it made the dear girls fond of me. At last, whenever a new pupil came who was a little downcast and unhappy, she was so sure, indeed I don't know why, to make a friend of me, that all newcomers were confided to my care. They said I was so gentle, but I am sure they were. I often thought of the resolution I had made on my birthday, to try to be industrious, contented, and true-hearted, and to do some good to some one, and to win some love if I could. And indeed, I felt almost ashamed to have done so little and have won so much. I passed at Greenleaf 6 happy, quiet years. I never saw in any face there, thank heaven, on my birthday, that it would have been better if I had never been born. When the day came round, it brought me so many tokens of affectionate remembrance that my room was beautiful with them from New Year's Day to Christmas. In those 6 years I had never been away, except on visits at holiday time in the neighbourhood. After the first 6 months or so, I had taken Miss Donny's advice in reference to the propriety of writing to Mr. Kenji to say that I was happy and grateful, and with her approval I had written such a letter. I had received a formal answer acknowledging its receipt, and saying, "We note the contents thereof, which shall be duly communicated to our client." After that, I sometimes heard Miss Donny and her sister mention how regular my accounts were paid, and about twice a year I ventured to write a similar letter. I always received by return of post exactly the same answer, in the same round hand, with the signature of Kenji and Carboy in another writing, which I suppose to be Mr. Kenji's. It seems so curious to me to be obliged to write all this about myself, as if this narrative were the narrative of my life. But my little body will soon fall into the background now. 6 quiet years, I find I am saying it for the second time, I had passed at Greenleaf, seeing in those around me, as it might be in a looking-glass, every stage of my own growth and change there, when one November morning I received this letter. I omit the date. Old Square, Lincoln's Inn. Madam, Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Our client, Mr. Jarndyce, being about to receive in his house, under an order of the Court of Chancery, a ward of the court in this cause, for whom he wishes to secure an eligible companion, directs us to inform you that he will be glad of your services in the aforesaid capacity. We have arranged for your being forwarded, carriage free, per 8 o'clock coach from Reading on Monday morning next to White Horse Cellar, Piccadilly, London, where one of our clerks will be in waiting to convey you to our office as above. We are, madam, your obedient servants, Kenji and Carboy. To Miss Esther Summerson. Oh, never, never, never shall I forget the emotion this letter caused in the house. It was so tender in them to care so much for me. It was so gracious in that father who had not forgotten me, to have made my orphan way so smooth and easy, and to have inclined so many youthful natures towards me, that I could hardly bear it. Not that I would have had them less sorry, I am afraid not, but the pleasure of it, and the pain of it, and the pride and joy of it, and the humble regret of it, were so blended that my heart seemed almost breaking while it was full of rapture. The letter gave me only 5 days' notice of my removal, when every minute added to the proofs of love and kindness that were given me in those 5 days, and when at last the morning came, and when they took me through all the rooms that I might see them for the last time, and when some cried, "Esther, my dear, say good-bye to me here at my bedside, where you first spoke so kindly to me," and when others asked me only to write their names, "With Esther's love," and when they all surrounded me with their parting presents, and clung to me weeping, and cried, "What shall we do when dear, dear Esther's gone?" and when I tried to tell them how forbearing and how good they had all been to me, and how I blessed and thanked them every one, what a heart I had. And when the 2 Miss Donnies grieved as much to part with me as the least among them, and when the maid said, "Bless you, miss, wherever you go," and when the ugly lame old gardener, who I thought had hardly noticed me in all these years, came panting after the coach to give me a little nosegay of geraniums, and told me I had been the light of his eyes. Indeed, the old man said so. What a heart I had then! And could I help it, if with all this, and the coming to the little school, and the unexpected sight of the poor children outside waving their hats and bonnets to me, and of a grey-haired gentleman and lady, whose daughter I had helped to teach, and at whose house I had visited, who were said to be the proudest people in all that country, caring for nothing but calling out, "Good-bye, Esther, may you be very happy," could I help it if I was quite bowed down in the coach by myself, and said, "Oh, I am so thankful, I am so thankful," many times over? But of course I soon considered that I must not take tears where I was going, after all that had been done for me. Therefore, of course, I made myself sob less, and persuaded myself to be quiet by saying very often, "Esther, now you really must. This will not do." I cheered myself up pretty well at last, though I am afraid I was longer about it than I ought to have been. And when I had cooled my eyes with lavender water, it was time to watch for London. I was quite persuaded that we were there when we were yet 10 miles off, and when we really were there, that we should never get there. However, when we began to jolt upon a stone pavement, and particularly when every other conveyance seemed to be running into us, and we seemed to be running into every other conveyance, I began to believe that we were really approaching the end of our journey. Very soon afterward we stopped. A young gentleman who had inked himself by accident addressed me from the pavement and said, "I am from Kenji and Carboys, miss, of Lincoln's Inn." "If you please, sir," said I. He was very obliging, and as he handed me into a fly, after superintending the removal of my boxes, I asked him whether there was a great fire anywhere, for the streets were so full of dense brown smoke that scarcely anything was to be seen. "Oh dear no, miss," he said. "This is a London particular." I had never heard of such a thing. "A fog, miss," said the young gentleman. "Oh, indeed," said I. We drove slowly through the dirtiest and darkest streets that ever were seen in the world, I thought, and in such a distracting state of confusion that I wondered how the people kept their senses, until we passed into sudden quietude under an old gateway, and drove on through a silent square until we came to an odd nook in a corner, where there was an entrance up a steep broad flight of stairs, like an entrance to a church. And there really was a churchyard outside under some cloisters, for I saw the gravestones from the staircase window. This was Kenji and Carboys. The young gentleman showed me through an outer office into Mr. Kenji's room. There was no one in it, and politely put an armchair for me by the fire. He then called my attention to a little looking-glass hanging from a nail on one side of the chimney-piece. "In case you should wish to look at yourself, miss, after the journey, as you're going before the Chancellor." "Not that it is requisite, I am sure," said the young gentleman civilly. "Going before the Chancellor?" I said, startled for a moment. "Only a matter of form, miss," returned the young gentleman. "Mr. Kenji is in court now. He left his compliments, and would you partake of some refreshment?" There were biscuits and a decanter of wine on a small table. "And look over the paper," which the young gentleman gave me as he spoke. He then stirred the fire and left me. Everything was so strange, the stranger from its being night in the daytime, and candles burning with a white flame, and looking raw and cold, that I read the words in the newspaper without knowing what they meant, and found myself reading the same words repeatedly. As it was of no use going on in that way, I put the paper down, took a peep at my bonnet in the glass to see if it was neat, and looked at the room, which was not half lighted, and at the shabby dusty tables, and at the piles of writing, and at the bookcase full of the most inexpressive looking books that ever had anything to say for themselves. Then I went on thinking, and the fire went on burning, and the candles went on flickering and guttering, and there were no snuffers, until the young gentleman by and by brought a very dirty pair, for 2 hours. At last Mr. Kenji came. He was not altered, but he was surprised to see how altered I was, and appeared quite pleased. "As you are going to be the companion of the young lady who is now in the Chancellor's private room, Miss Summerson," he said, "we thought it well that you should be in attendance also. You will not be discomposed by the Lord Chancellor, I dare say." "No, sir," I said, "I don't think I shall," really not seeing on any consideration why I should be. So Mr. Kenji gave me his arm, and we went round the corner under a colonnade and in at a side door. And so we came, along a passage, into a comfortable sort of room, where a young lady and a young gentleman were standing near a great loud roaring fire. A screen was interposed between them, and they were leaning on the screen, talking. They both looked up when I came in, and I saw in the young lady, with the fire shining upon her, such a beautiful girl, with such rich golden hair, such soft blue eyes, and such a bright, innocent, trusting face. "Miss Ada," said Mr. Kenji, "this is Miss Summerson." She came to meet me with a smile of welcome and her hand extended, but seemed to change her mind in a moment and kissed me. In short, she had such a natural, captivating, winning manner, that in a few minutes we were sitting in the window seat, with the light of the fire upon us, talking together as free and happy as could be. What a load off my mind! It was so delightful to know that she could confide in me, and like me. It was so good of her, and so encouraging to me. The young gentleman was her distant cousin, she told me, and his name Richard Carstone. He was a handsome youth with an ingenuous face and a most engaging laugh, and after she had called him up to where we sat, he stood by us in the light of the fire too, talking gaily, like a light-hearted boy. He was very young, not more than 19 then, if quite so much, but nearly 2 years older than she was. They were both orphans, and what was very unexpected and curious to me, had never met before that day. Our all three coming together for the first time in such an unusual place was a thing to talk about, and we talked about it, and the fire, which had left off roaring, winked its red eyes at us, as Richard said, like a drowsy old chancery lion. We conversed in low tone, because a full-dressed gentleman in a bag wig frequently came in and out, and when he did so, we could hear a drawling sound in the distance, which he said was one of the counsel in our case addressing the Lord Chancellor. He told Mr. Kenji that the Chancellor would be up in 5 minutes, and presently we heard a bustle and a tread of feet, and Mr. Kenji said that the court had risen, and that his lordship was in the next room. The gentleman in the bag wig opened the door almost directly, and requested Mr. Kenji to come in. Upon that we all went into the next room, Mr. Kenji first, with my darling. It is so natural to me now that I can't help writing it. And there, plainly dressed in black, and sitting in an armchair at a table near the fire, was his lordship, whose robe, trimmed with beautiful gold lace, was thrown upon another chair. He gave us a searching look as we entered, but his manner was both courtly and kind. The gentleman in the bag wig laid bundles of papers on his lordship's table, and his lordship silently selected one and turned over the leaves. "Miss Clare," said the Lord Chancellor. "Miss Ada Clare?" Mr. Kenji presented her, and his lordship begged her to sit down near him. Then he admired her, and was interested by her. Even I could see in a moment. It touched me that in the home of such a beautiful young creature should be represented by that dry official place. The Lord High Chancellor at his best appeared so poor a substitute for the love and pride of parents. "The jaundice in question," said the Lord Chancellor, still turning over leaves, "is jaundice of Bleak House." "Jaundice of Bleak House, my lord," said Mr. Kenji. "A dreary name," said the Lord Chancellor. "But not a dreary place at present, my lord," said Mr. Kenji. "And Bleak House," said his lordship, "is in Hertfordshire, my lord." "Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House is not married?" said his lordship. "He is not, my lord," said Mr. Kenji. A pause. "Young Mr. Richard Carstone is present?" said the Lord Chancellor, glancing toward him. Richard bowed and stepped forward. "Hum," said the Lord Chancellor, turning over more leaves. "Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House, my lord," Mr. Kenji observed in a low voice, "if I may venture to remind you, your lordship, provides a suitable companion for Mr. Carstone? I thought, but I am not quite sure," I heard his lordship say in an equally low voice and with a smile. "For Miss Ada Clare. This is the young lady, Miss Summerson." His lordship gave me an indulgent look and acknowledged my curtsy very graciously. "Miss Summerson is not related to any party in the cause, I think?" "No, my lord." Mr. Kenji leant over before it was quite said, and whispered. His lordship, with his eyes upon his papers, listened, nodded twice or thrice, turned over more leaves, and did not look towards me again until we were going away. Mr. Kenji now retired, and Richard with him, to where I was, near the door, leaving my pet. It is so natural to me that again I can't help it, sitting near the Lord Chancellor, with whom his lordship spoke a little apart, asking her, as she told me afterwards, whether she had well reflected on the proposed arrangement, and if she thought she would be happy under the roof of Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House, and why she thought so. Presently he rose courteously and released her, and then he spoke for a minute or two with Richard Carstone, not seated, but standing, altogether with more ease and less ceremony, as if he still knew, though he was Lord Chancellor, how to go straight to the candour of a boy. "Very well," said his lordship, aloud. "I shall make the order. Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House has chosen, so far as I may judge," and this was when he looked at me, "a very good companion for the young lady, and the arrangement altogether seems the best of which the circumstances admit." He dismissed us pleasantly, and we all went out, very much obliged to him for being so affable and polite, by which he had certainly lost no dignity, but seemed to us to have gained some. When we got under the colonnade, Mr. Kenji remembered that he must go back for a moment to ask a question, and left us in the fog, with the Lord Chancellor's carriage and servants waiting for him to come out. "Well," said Richard Carstone, "that's over, and where do we go next, Miss Summerson?" "Don't you know?" I said. "Not in the least," said he. "And don't you know, my love?" I asked Ada. "No," said she. "Don't you?" "Not at all," said I. We looked at one another, half laughing at our being like the children in the wood, when a curious little woman in a squeezed bonnet and carrying a reticule came curtsying and smiling up to us, with an air of great ceremony. "Oh," said she, "the wards in Jarndyce. Very happy, I am sure, to have the honour. It is a good omen for youth, and hope, and beauty, when they find themselves in this place, and don't know what's come of it." "Mad," whispered Richard, not thinking she could hear him. "Right, mad, young gentleman," she returned so quickly that he was quite abashed. "I was a ward myself. I was not mad at that time," curtsying low, and smiling between every little sentence. "I had youth and hope, I believe, beauty. It matters very little now. None of the three served or saved me. I have the honour to attend court regularly, with my documents. I expect a judgment shortly, on the day of judgment. I have discovered that the sixth seal mentioned in the Revelations is the Great Seal. It has been open a long time. Pray accept my blessing." As Ada was a little frightened, I said, to humour the poor old lady, that we were much obliged to her. "Yes," she said mincingly, "I imagine so. And here is Conversation Kenji, with his documents. How does your honourable worship do?" "Quite well, quite well. Now don't be troublesome, that's a good soul," said Mr. Kenji, leading the way back. "By no means," said the poor old lady, keeping up with Ada and me. "Anything but troublesome. I shall confer estates on both, which is not being troublesome, I trust. I expect a judgment shortly, on the day of judgment. This is a good omen for you. Accept my blessing." She stopped at the bottom of the steep, broad flight of stairs, but we looked back as we went up, and she was still there, saying, still with a curtsy and a smile between every little sentence, "Youth, and hope, and beauty, and chancery, and Conversation Kenji, ha! Pray accept my blessing." End of chapter 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 4. Telescopic Philanthropy. We were to pass the night, Mr. Kenji told us when we arrived in his room, at Mrs. Jellyby's, and then he turned to me and said he took it for granted I knew whom Mrs. Jellyby was. "I really don't, sir," I returned. "Perhaps Mr. Carstone or Miss Clare." But no, they knew nothing whatever about Mrs. Jellyby. "Indeed, Mrs. Jellyby," said Mr. Kenji, standing with his back to the fire and casting his eyes over the dusty hearth-rug as if it were Mrs. Jellyby's biography, "is a lady of very remarkable strength of character, who devotes herself entirely to the public. She has devoted herself to an extensive variety of public subjects at various times, and is at present, until something else attracts her, devoted to the subject of Africa, with a view to the general cultivation of the coffee-berry and the natives, and the happy settlement on the banks of the African rivers of our superabundant home population. Mr. Jarndyce, who is desirous to aid any work that is considered likely to be a good work, and who is much sought after by philanthropists, has, I believe, a very high opinion of Mrs. Jellyby." Mr. Kenji, adjusting his cravat, then looked at us. "And Mr. Jellyby, sir?" suggested Richard. "Ah, Mr. Jellyby," said Mr. Kenji, I don't know that I can describe him to you better than by saying that he is the husband of Mrs. Jellyby." "A nonentity, sir?" said Richard, with a droll look. "I don't say that," returned Mr. Kenji gravely. "I can't say that, indeed, for I know nothing whatever of Mr. Jellyby. I never, to my knowledge, had the pleasure of seeing Mr. Jellyby. He may be a very superior man, but he is, so to speak, merged in the more shining qualities of his wife." Mr. Kenji proceeded to tell us that as the road to Bleak House would have been very long, dark, and tedious on such an evening, and as we had been travelling already, Mr. Jarndyce had himself proposed this arrangement. A carriage would be at Mrs. Jellyby's to convey us out of town early in the forenoon of tomorrow. He then rang a little bell, and the young gentleman came in. Addressing him by the name of Guppy, Mr. Kenji inquired whether Miss Summerson's boxes and the rest of the baggage had been sent round. Mr. Guppy said yes, they had been sent round, and a coach was waiting to take us round too as soon as we pleased. "Then it only remains," said Mr. Kenji, shaking hands with us, "for me to express my lively satisfaction in, good day, Miss Clare, the arrangement this day concluded, and my good-bye to you, Miss Summerson, lively hope that it will conduce to the happiness, glad to have had the honour of making your acquaintance, Mr. Carstone, welfare, the advantage in all points of view of all concerned. Guppy, see the party safely there." "Where is there, Mr. Guppy?" said Richard as we went downstairs. "No distance," said Mr. Guppy. "Round in Tavy's Inn, you know." "I can't say I know where it is, for I come from Winchester, and I'm strange in London." "Only round the corner," said Mr. Guppy. "We just twist up Chancery Lane, and cut along Holborn, and there we are in 4 minutes' time, as near as a toucher. This is about a London particular now, ain't it, miss?" He seemed quite delighted with it on my account. "The fog is very dense indeed," said I. "Not that it affects you, though, I'm sure," said Mr. Guppy, putting up the steps. "On the contrary, it seems to do you good, miss, judging from your appearance." I knew he meant well in paying me this compliment, so I laughed at myself for blushing at it, when he had shut the door and got upon the box. And we all three laughed and chatted about our inexperience and the strangeness of London until we turned up under an archway to our destination. a narrow street of high houses, like an oblong cistern to hold the fog. There was a confused little crowd of people, principally children, gathered about the house at which we stopped, which had a tarnished brass plate on the door, with the inscription "Jellyby." "Don't be frightened," said Mr. Guppy, looking in at the coach window. "One of the young Jellybys been and got his head through the area railings." "Oh, poor child," said I. "Let me out, if you please." "Pray be careful of yourself, miss. The young Jellybys are always up to something," said Mr. Guppy. I made my way to the poor child, who was one of the dirtiest little unfortunates I ever saw, and found him very hot and frightened, and crying loudly, fixed by the neck between two iron railings, while a milkman and a beadle, with the kindest intentions possible, were endeavouring to drag him back by the legs, under a general impression that his skull was compressible by those means. As I found, after pacifying him, that he was a little boy with a naturally large head, I thought, perhaps, where his head could go, his body could follow, and mentioned that the best mode of extraction might be to push him forward. This was so favourably received by the milkman and the beadle, that he would immediately have been pushed into the area, if I had not held his pinafore, while Richard and Mr. Guppy ran down through the kitchen to catch him when he should be released. At last he was happily got down without any accident, and then he began to beat Mr. Guppy with a hoop stick in quite a frantic manner. Nobody had appeared belonging to the house, except a person in pattens, who had been poking at the child from below with a broom. I don't know with what object, and I don't think she did. I therefore supposed that Mrs. Jellyby was not at home, and was quite surprised when the person appearing in the passage without the pattens, and going up the back room on the first floor before Ada and me, announced us as "them two young ladies, Mrs. Jellyby." We passed several more children on the way up, whom it was difficult to avoid treading on in the dark, and as we came into Mrs. Jellyby's presence, one of the poor little things fell downstairs, down a whole flight, as it sounded to me, with a great noise. Mrs. Jellyby, whose face reflected none of the uneasiness which we could not help showing in our own faces, as the dear child's head recorded its passage with a bump on every stair (Richard afterwards said he counted 7, besides one for the landing), received us with perfect equanimity. She was a pretty, very diminutive, plump woman, of from 40 to 50, with handsome eyes, though they had a curious habit of seeming to look a long way off, as if, I am quoting Richard again, they could see nothing nearer than Africa. "I am very glad indeed," said Mrs. Jellyby in an agreeable voice, "to have the pleasure of receiving you. I have a great respect for Mr. Jarndyce, and no one in whom he is interested can be an object of indifference to me." We expressed our acknowledgments, and sat down behind the door, where there was a lame invalid of a sofa. Mrs. Jellyby had very good hair, but was too much occupied with her African duties to brush it. The shawl in which she had been loosely muffled dropped onto her chair when she advanced to us, and as she turned to resume her seat, we could not help noticing that her dress didn't nearly meet up the back, and that the open space was railed across with a lattice work of stay lace, like a summer house. The room, which was strewn with papers and nearly filled by a great writing table covered with similar litter, was, I must say, not only very untidy, but very dirty. We were obliged to take notice of that with our sense of sight, even while, with our sense of hearing, we followed the poor child who had tumbled downstairs, I think into the back kitchen, where somebody seemed to stifle him. But what principally struck us was a jaded and unhealthy-looking, though by no means plain girl, at the writing-table, who sat biting the feather of her pen and staring at us. I suppose nobody was ever in such a state of ink, and, from her tumbled hair to her pretty feet, which were disfigured with frayed and broken satin slippers trodden down at heel, she really seemed to have no article of dress upon her, from a pin upward, that was in its proper condition or its right place. "You can find me, my dears," said Mrs. Jellyby, snuffing the 2 great office candles in tin candlesticks, which made the room taste strongly of hot tallow. The fire had gone out, and there was nothing in the grate but ashes, a bundle of wood, and a poker. "You find me, my dears, as usual, very busy, but that you will excuse. The African project at present employs my whole time. It involves me in correspondence with public bodies, and with private individuals anxious for the welfare of their species all over the country. I am happy to say it is advancing. We hope by this time next year to have from 150 to 200 healthy families cultivating coffee and educating the natives of Borrioboola on the left bank of the Niger." As Ada said nothing, but looked at me, I said it must be very gratifying. "It is gratifying," said Mrs. Jellyby. "It involves the devotion of all my energies, such as they are, but that is nothing, so that it succeeds, and I am more confident of success every day. Do you know, Miss Summerson, I almost wonder that you never turned your thoughts to Africa." This application of the subject was really so unexpected to me that I was quite at a loss as to how to receive it. I hinted that the climate, "The finest climate in the world," said Mrs. Jellyby. "Indeed, ma'am." "Certainly, with precaution," said Mrs. Jellyby. "You may go into Holborn without precaution and be run over. You may go into Holborn with precaution and never be run over. Just so with Africa." I said, "No doubt." I meant as to Holborn. "If you would like," said Mrs. Jellyby, putting a number of papers towards us, "to look over some remarks on that head, and on the general subject, which have been extensively circulated, while I finish a letter I am now dictating to my eldest daughter, who is my amanuensis." The girl at the table left off biting her pen, and made a return to our recognition, which was half bashful and half sulky. "I shall then have finished for the present," proceeded Mrs. Jellyby with a sweet smile, "though my work is never done. Where are you, Caddy?" "Presents her compliments to Mr. Swallow, and begs," said Caddy. "And begs," said Mrs. Jellyby, dictating, "to inform him in reference to his letter of inquiry on the African project. No, Peepy, not on any account." Peepy, so self-named, was the unfortunate child who had fallen downstairs, who now interrupted the correspondence by presenting himself with a strip of plaster on his forehead, to exhibit his wounded knees, in which Ada and I did not know which to pity most, the bruises or the dirt. Mrs. Jellyby merely added, with the serene composure with which she said everything, "Go along, you naughty Peepy," and fixed her fine eyes on Africa again. However, as she at once proceeded with her dictation, and as I interrupted nothing by doing it, I ventured quietly to stop poor Peepy as he was going out, and to take him up to nurse. He looked very much astonished at it, and at Ada's kissing him, but soon fell fast asleep in my arms, sobbing at longer and longer intervals until he was quiet. I was so occupied with Peepy that I lost the letter in detail, though I derived such a general impression from it of the momentous importance of Africa, and the utter insignificance of all other places and things, that I felt quite ashamed to have thought so little about it. 6 o'clock, said Mrs. Jellyby, and our dinner hour is nominally, for we dine at all hours, 5. Caddy, show Miss Clare and Miss Summerson their rooms. You will like to make some change, perhaps. You will excuse me, I know, being so much occupied. Oh, that very bad child! Pray put him down, Miss Summerson. I begged permission to retain him, truly saying that he was not at all troublesome, and carried him upstairs and laid him upon my bed. Ada and I had 2 upper rooms, with a door of communication between. They were excessively bare and disorderly, and the curtain to my window was fastened up with a fork. You would like some hot water, wouldn't you? Said Miss Jellyby, looking round for a jug with a handle to it, but looking in vain. If it is not being troublesome, said we. Oh, it is not the trouble, returned Miss Jellyby. The question is, if there is any. The evening was so very cold, and the rooms had such a marshy smell, that I confess it was a little miserable, and Ada was half crying. We soon laughed, however, and were busily unpacking, when Miss Jellyby came back to say that she was sorry there was no hot water, but they couldn't find the kettle, and the boiler was out of order. We begged her not to mention it, and made all the haste we could to get down to the fire again. But the little children had come up to the landing outside to look at the phenomenon of Peepy lying on my bed, and our attention was distracted by the constant apparition of noises and fingers, in situations of danger between the hinges of the doors. It was impossible to shut the door of either room, for my lock, with no knob to it, looked as if it wanted to be wound up, and though the handle of Ada's went round and round with the greatest smoothness, it was attended with no effect whatever on the door. Therefore I proposed to the children that they should come in and be very good at my table, and I would tell them the story of Little Red Riding Hood while I dressed, which they did, and were as quiet as mice, including Peepy, who awoke opportunely before the appearance of the wolf. When we went downstairs, we found a mug with "A present from Tunbridge Wells" on it, lighted up in the staircase window with a floating wick, and a young woman with a swelled face bound up in a flannel bandage, blowing the fire of the drawing-room, now connected by an open door with Mrs. Jellyby's room, and choking dreadfully. It smoked to that degree, in short, that we all sat coughing and crying with the windows open for half an hour, during which Mrs. Jellyby, with the same sweetness of temper, directed letters about Africa. Her being so employed was, I must say, a great relief to me, for Richard told us that he had washed his hands in a pie dish, and that they had found the kettle on his dressing-table, and he made Ada laugh so, that they made me laugh in the most ridiculous manner. Soon after 7 o'clock we went down to dinner, carefully, by Mrs. Jellyby's advice, for the stair carpets, beside being very deficient in stair wires, were so torn as to be absolute traps. We had a fine codfish, a piece of roast beef, a dish of cutlets, and a pudding, an excellent dinner, if it had had any cooking to speak, but it was almost raw. The young woman with the flannel bandage waited, and dropped everything on the table wherever it happened to go, and never moved it again until she put it on the stairs. The person I had seen in pattens, who I supposed to have been the cook, frequently came and skirmished with her at the door, and there appeared to be ill will between them. All through dinner, which was long, in consequence of such accidents as the dish of potatoes being mislaid in the coal scuttle, and the handle of the corkscrew coming off and striking the young woman in the chin, Mrs. Jellyby preserved the evenness of her disposition. She told us a great deal that was interesting about Borrioboola Gha and the natives, and received so many letters that Richard, who sat by her, saw 4 envelopes in the gravy at once. Some of the letters were proceedings of ladies' committees, or resolutions of ladies' meetings, which she read to us. Others were applications from people excited in various ways about the cultivation of coffee and natives. Others required answers, and these she sent her eldest daughter from the table 3 or 4 times to write. She was full of business, and undoubtedly was, as she had told us, devoted to the cause. I was a little curious to know who a mild bald gentleman in spectacles was, who dropped into a vacant chair (there was no top or bottom in particular) after the fish was taken away, and seemed passively to submit himself to Borrioboola, but not to be actively interested in that settlement. As he never spoke a word, he might have been a native, but for his complexion. It was not until we left the table and he remained alone with Richard that the possibility of his being Mr. Jellyby ever entered my head. But he was Mr. Jellyby, and a loquacious young man called Mr. Quayle, with large shining knobs for temples and his hair brushed to the back of his head, who came in the evening and told Ada he was a philanthropist, also informed her that he called the matrimonial alliance of Mrs. Jellyby with Mr. Jellyby the union of mind and matter. This young man, besides having a great deal to say for himself about Africa, and a project of his for teaching the coffee colonists to teach the natives to turn pianoforte legs and establish an export trade, delighted in drawing Mrs. Jellyby out by saying, "I believe now, Mrs. Jellyby, you have received as many as from 150 to 200 letters respecting Africa in a single day, have you not? Or, if my memory does not deceive me, Mrs. Jellyby, you once mentioned that you had sent off 5,000 circulars from one post office at one time," always repeating Mrs. Jellyby's answer to us like an interpreter. During the whole evening Mr. Jellyby sat in a corner with his head against the wall, as if he were subject to low spirits. It seemed that he had several times opened his mouth when alone with Richard after dinner, as if he had something on his mind, but had always shut it again, to Richard's extreme confusion, without saying anything. Mrs. Jellyby, sitting in quite a nest of waste paper, drank coffee all the evening, and dictated at intervals to her eldest daughter. She also held a discussion with Mr. Quayle, of which the subject seemed to be, if I understood it, the brotherhood of humanity, and gave utterance to some beautiful sentiments. I was not so attentive an auditor as I might have wished to be, however, for Peepy and the other children came flocking about Ada and me in a corner of the drawing-room to ask for another story, so we sat down among them and told them in whispers Puss in Boots, and I don't know what else, until Mrs. Jellyby, accidentally remembering them, sent them to bed. As Peepy cried for me to take him to bed, I carried him upstairs, where the young woman with the flannel bandage charged into the midst of the little family like a dragon, and overturned them into cribs. After that I occupied myself in making our room a little tidy, and in coaxing a very cross fire that had been lighted to burn, which at last it did, quite brightly. On my return downstairs, I felt that Mrs. Jellyby looked down upon me rather for being so frivolous, and I was sorry for it, though at the same time I knew that I had no higher pretensions. It was nearly midnight before we found an opportunity of going to bed, and even then we left Mrs. Jellyby among her papers drinking coffee, and Miss Jellyby biting the feather of her pen. "What a strange house!" said Ada, when we got upstairs. "How curious of my cousin Jarndyce to send us here!" My love, said I, it quite confuses me. I want to understand it, and I can't understand it at all. What? Said Ada with her pretty smile. All this, my dear, said I. It must be very good of Mrs. Jellyby to take such pains about a scheme for the benefit of natives, and yet Peepy and the housekeeping. Ada laughed and put her arm about my neck as I stood looking at the fire, and told me I was a quiet, dear, good creature, and had won her heart. You are so thoughtful, Esther, she said, and yet so cheerful, and you do so much so unpretendingly. You would make a home out of even this house. My simple darling, she was quite unconscious that she only praised herself, and that it was the goodness of her own heart that she made so much of me. May I ask you a question? Said I, when we had sat before the fire a little while. 500, said Ada. Your cousin, Mr. Jarndyce. I owe so much to him. Would you mind describing him to me? Shaking her golden hair, Ada turned her eyes upon me with such laughing wonder that I was full of wonder too, partly at her beauty, partly at her surprise. Esther, she cried, my dear, you want a description of my cousin Jarndyce? My dear, I never saw him. And I never saw him, returned Ada. Well, to be sure. No, she had never seen him. Young as she was when her mamma died, she remembered how the tears would come into her eyes when she spoke of him, and of the noble generosity of his character, which she had said was to be trusted above all earthly things, and Ada trusted it. Her cousin Jarndyce had written to her a few months ago, a plain, honest letter, Ada said, proposing the arrangement we were now to enter on, and telling her that, in time, it might heal some of the wounds made by the miserable Chancery suit. She had replied, gratefully accepting his proposal. Richard had received a similar letter, and had made a similar response. He had seen Mr. Jarndyce once, but only once, 5 years ago, at Winchester School. He had told Ada, when they were leaning on the screen before the fire, where I found them, that he recollected him as a bluff, rosy fellow. This was the utmost description Ada could give me. It set me thinking so, that when Ada was asleep, I still remained before the fire, wondering and wondering about Bleak House, and wondering that yesterday morning should seem so long ago. I don't know where my thoughts had wandered when they were recalled by a tap at the door. I opened it softly, and found Miss Jellyby shivering there, with a broken candle in a broken candlestick in one hand, and said on a sudden, I was going to remonstrate. I do, she said. Don't talk to me, Miss Summerson. I hate it and detest it. It's a beast. I told her she was tired, and I was sorry. I put my hand upon her head and touched her forehead, and said it was hot now, but would be cool tomorrow. She still stood, pouting and frowning at me, but presently put down her egg cup and turned softly toward the bed where Ada lay. She is very pretty, she said, with the same knitted brow and in the same uncivil manner. I assented with a smile. An orphan, ain't she? Yes. But knows a quantity, I suppose. Can dance, play music, and sing. She can talk French, I suppose, and do geography and globes and needlework and everything. No doubt, said I. I can't, she returned. I can't do anything hardly, except write. I'm always writing for Ma. I wonder you two were not ashamed of yourselves to come in this afternoon and see me able to do nothing else. It was like your ill nature. Yet you think yourselves very fine, I dare say. I could see that the poor girl was near crying, and I resumed my chair without speaking, and looked at her, I hope, as mildly as I felt towards her. It's disgraceful, she said. You know it is. The whole house is disgraceful. The children are disgraceful. I'm disgraceful. Pa's miserable. And no wonder. Priscilla drinks. She's always drinking. It's a great shame and a great story of you. If you say you didn't smell her today, it was as bad as a public house, waiting at dinner. You know it was. My dear, I don't know it, said I. You do, she said very shortly. You shan't say you don't. You do. Oh, my dear, said I, if you won't let me speak. You're speaking now. You know you are. Don't tell stories, Miss Summerson. My dear, said I, as long as you won't hear me out. I don't want to hear you out. Oh, yes, I think you do, said I, because that would be so very unreasonable. I did not know what you tell me, because the servant did not come near me at dinner, but I don't doubt what you tell me, and I am sorry to hear it. You needn't make a merit of that, said she. No, my dear, said I, that would be very foolish. She was still standing by the bed, and now stooped down, but still with the same discontented face, and kissed Ada. That done, she came softly back and stood by the side of my chair. Her bosom was heaving in a distressful manner that I pitied her, but I thought it was better not to speak. I wish I was dead, she broke out. I wish we were all dead. It would be a great deal better for us. In a moment afterward, she knelt on the ground at my side, hid her face in my dress, passionately begged my pardon, and wept. I comforted her, and would have raised her, but she cried, No, no, she wanted to stay there. You used to teach girls, she said. If you could only have taught me, I could have learned from you. I am so very miserable, and I like you so much. I could not persuade her to sit by me, or to do anything but move a ragged stool to where she was kneeling, and take that, and still hold my dress in the same manner. By degrees the poor tired girl fell asleep, and then I contrived to raise her head so that it should rest on my lap, and to cover us both with shawls. The fire went out, and all night long she slumbered thus before the ashy grate. At first I was painfully awake, and vainly tried to lose myself with my eyes closed among the scenes of the day. At length, by slow degrees, they became indistinct and mingled. I began to lose the identity of the sleeper resting on me. Now it was Ada, now one of my old Reading friends from whom I could not believe I had so recently parted. Now it was the little mad woman worn out with curtsying and smiling. Now someone in authority at Bleak House. Lastly, it was no one, and I was no one. The purblind day was feebly struggling with the fog when I opened my eyes to encounter those of a dirty-faced little spectre fixed upon me. Peepy had scaled his crib and crept down in his bedgown and cap, and was so cold that his teeth were chattering as if he had cut them all. End of chapter 4.